Hi guys.
Life in the Middle Ages was not exactly built for romance. It was built for surviving the winter, avoiding the plague, and trying not to anger the local lord. Love, in the way people think of it today, and with flowers, poetry, and long walks, was not on the list of priorities. If someone happened to feel something warm and fuzzy for another person, it was usually treated like a minor illness. Nothing serious, but best not discussed at dinner. The idea that two people should marry because they liked each other was about as common as a clean bath. Most people never had one, and those who did kept quiet about it. Marriages were arranged, and that was that. It didn't matter if the bride thought the groom looked like a wet sheep, or if the groom believed the bride could curse crops with a single glance. What mattered was land, money, and family reputation. A good match meant better fields, more cattle, or a stronger alliance with a powerful neighbour. Love, if it showed up at all, was expected to wait quietly in the corner, like an unwanted relative. And if it caused trouble, it was shown the door without a second thought. Children were often promised to each other before they could read or write. A noble family might sign a contract when the future couple were still playing with sticks and pretending they were knights. By the time they grew up, the decision was already made. There was no point in dreaming of someone else. Dreams didn't pay taxes. Dreams couldn't defend a castle during a siege. And if a young person dared to say they were in love with someone outside the agreement, the reaction was rarely kind. Parents would sigh, shake their heads, and remind them that feelings were not currency. You couldn't trade longing for a stable or passion for a village. The church, of course, had its own views on the matter. It didn't hate love exactly, but it certainly didn't trust it. Emotions were seen as unstable, like a cart with a loose wheel. They could tip over at any moment and ruin everything. So love was allowed, but only in the right place, inside a marriage approved by the church and blessed with holy words. Anything else was suspicious. A lingering look could be temptation. A secret meeting in the garden, probably sin. Holding hands for too long. That was practically a crime against order and decency. People were expected to control themselves, especially women. A man might get away with a few foolish glances or a drunken compliment, but a woman showing too much interest in someone was seen as dangerous, like leaving a candle near dry hay. Someone could get burned. Reputation was everything, and once it was damaged, it was nearly impossible to fix. A woman known for being too friendly might never marry at all, or worse, she might be married off quickly to someone no one else wanted, as a way of sweeping the problem under the rug. Even in stories, love was rarely simple. The tales of knights and ladies were full of longing, secret messages, and tragic endings. But these were not guides for real life. They were more like warnings wrapped in pretty words. A knight falling for a married lady might write poems about her eyes, but in real life, he'd be lucky to keep his head. Courts were full of rules, and breaking them for love was not seen as brave. It was seen as stupid, like bringing a spoon to a sword fight. And yet, people still felt things. They looked at each other and felt something strange in their chest. They wrote notes they never sent. They stood too close during dances. They remembered the sound of someone's voice, but most of them knew better than to act on it. Acting meant risk meant trouble, and trouble in the Middle Ages usually meant pain, exile, or silence. The idea of choosing your own partner was almost laughable. It was like deciding to grow only purple turnips just because you liked the colour. The world didn't work that way. You grew what the land allowed, what the season supported, what the Lord demanded. And so, love was not a choice. It was a side effect. Something that happened when no one was looking, in quiet moments between chores and prayers. It was not celebrated, it was not encouraged, but it was there, quietly, like moss on a stone, unnoticed, unimportant, but impossible to completely remove. Some people tried to make the best of arranged marriages. They learned to tolerate each other, to work together, to share a bed without hating the face across from them. Others simply gave up on the idea of affection. They focused on duty, on children, on survival, and if they dreamed of something more, they kept it to themselves. Dreams were safer that way. No one could punish you for what they didn't know. It wasn't that people didn't care about love, it was that they knew it was dangerous. Not because of the emotion itself, but because of what came after. Conflicts, broken alliances, ruined families, angry lords, jealous spouses. Love had a way of making people do foolish things, like speaking out of turn, refusing orders, or running away. And in a world where order was fragile and power was everything, foolish things were not forgiven. So love was tucked away, hidden in songs, buried in glances, locked in diaries that were never finished. It was not dead, it was just waiting for a time when people could afford to be soft, when a heart could beat loudly without fear of punishment. That time was still centuries away, but every now and then someone still looked into another's eyes and forgot the rules, just for a moment, long enough to feel something real. And then they looked away, back to the dirt, the chores, the silence. After all, the world kept turning. The cows still needed milking, the fields still needed ploughing, and the local priest still had a list of sins to go over on Sunday. Love, in the end, was just another thing that didn't fit into the schedule. If someone in the Middle Ages had a crush on a person from the wrong social class, it was not just awkward. It was like trying to join a game of chess with a bag of potatoes. The rules didn't allow it, the board wasn't built for it, and everyone else would just stare. Society back then was not exactly flexible. It had layers like an onion, but without the excuse of making you cry. At the top were kings, lords and knights, people who owned land and made decisions. Below them came the clergy, who prayed and reminded everyone else to behave. Then came the merchants, who counted money and tried not to offend anyone important. And at the bottom, the peasants, who did most of the work and owned almost nothing, including their own time. Falling in love across these layers was not encouraged. It was like trying to mix oil and water. The two might end up in the same bowl, but they would never become one. A nobleman looking too closely at a milkmaid was risking gossip, and gossip could turn into scandal. A servant dreaming of the Lord's daughter was not being romantic, they were being foolish. And foolishness in those days often came with consequences. The higher the gap between classes, the worse the punishment if feelings were discovered. Love was not blind, it was just very bad at judging danger. There are stories, of course, of people who tried. A young squire might write clumsy poems about the daughter of a baron. A village girl might blush every time the young lord passed by on horseback. But these moments rarely led to happy endings. More often they ended with someone being sent away, to another estate, another village, or straight into a monastery. Monasteries were very good at solving social problems. They took away the person, the temptation, and sometimes even the memory. No questions asked, no drama needed, just silence and prayer, with the occasional beet soup. The rules were clear, even if they were never written down. You did not look at your betters for too long. You did not speak unless spoken to. You certainly did not imagine holding hands during a winter walk. That was not love. That was a career-ending mistake. And for the nobility, marriage was a tool, not a celebration. It was used to strengthen alliances, secure land, or please the king. If a lord's son wanted to marry a baker's daughter, his father would not sigh and say, "Ah, youth." He would sigh and say, "No, and by the way, you're going to France next week to meet the duke's niece." And that would be the end of it. Even friendships between classes were watched carefully. A knight spending too much time with a peasant's son might be accused of lowering himself. A lady chatting too freely with a servant could be seen as losing dignity. The social order was like a carefully stacked pile of stones. One wrong move, and the whole thing might tip. And when it fell, it usually landed on the person with the lowest rank. The noble might get a scolding, the peasant got a beating, or worse. There was a kind of humour in how seriously people took these rules. A man could survive war, plague, and a bad harvest, but fall apart because his daughter smiled at the wrong person. Families would panic over a rumour as if it were an invading army. A single rumour could ruin a marriage plan, damage a reputation, or start a feud. And yet, no one questioned the system. It was just the way things were. Like rain in April or fleas in summer. You didn't fight it, you just learned to live with it. Women had it harder, of course. A noblewoman caught speaking privately with a commoner could be locked in her room for weeks. Her letters might be read, her movements watched. She might be married off early to someone she had never met, just to make sure she didn't cause any more trouble. Men could travel, serve in wars, make mistakes, and come back. Women were expected to stay clean, quiet, and obedient. Their value was tied to their purity, which was not about them as people, but about what they could bring to a marriage. A woman with a stain on her name was like a coin with a scratch, still metal, but worth less. And yet somehow, people still felt things. They saw someone across a field and felt a strange pull. They heard a voice and forgot what they were doing. They noticed the way someone tied their shoes or smiled at a dog, and for a moment the class system didn't matter. But then the moment passed. The noble went back to his horse. The peasant went back to ploughing, and the feeling was tucked away, like a small stone in a pocket, heavy but hidden. The church didn't help much. It taught that all people were equal in the eyes of God, which was a nice idea, but not one that changed daily life. In practice, God seemed to care more about who was paying for the candles. Priests rarely spoke out against injustice unless it threatened order. And love between classes, that was not justice, that was disruption. Better to suffer in silence than to risk chaos. There were, of course, exceptions. Some lords married their servants after their wives died. Some merchants became rich and bought their way into the lower nobility. But these were rare, and they usually happened only when money or power was involved. Love on its own was not enough. It didn't open doors, it didn't win battles, it didn't feed an army, so it was ignored or punished. The irony was that the higher you were in society, the less choice you often had in love. Kings married for politics, princes were sent abroad to marry strangers, even wealthy merchants had to think about business when choosing a spouse. The only people with any real freedom were the poorest, but even then, only up to a point. A peasant could marry another peasant, yes, but if that peasant happened to be from a family the village didn't like, there could still be trouble. Love was never really free. It always came with conditions, and so most people learned not to hope too much. They accepted who they were told to marry. They tried to be kind, or at least polite. They focused on children, work, and surviving the next winter. If they dreamed of something else, they kept it to themselves. Dreams were safe. Dreams didn't require permission. Dreams didn't make lords angry or families ashamed. You could dream of a different life, a different person, a different world, and no one would ever know. Sometimes people tried to escape. Two lovers might run away to a distant town, hoping to start over. But life on the road was harsh. Without family, without land, without status, they were nobodies. They couldn't own property. They couldn't get fair treatment in court. They were suspicious by default, and if they were caught, the punishment was often worse than staying. The man might be beaten or forced into service. The woman might be sent back in shame, or married off immediately to someone older, someone stricter. So most stayed. They lived their lives within the lines drawn for them. They loved quietly, if at all. They remembered faces, voices, moments, and then buried them under routine. The world kept moving. The seasons changed. The same songs were sung at weddings, the same prayers said at funerals, and love, when it appeared, was either approved, ignored, or hidden, but never truly welcome. It wasn't that people didn't want it. It was that they knew the cost, and for most the price was simply too high. Knights writing love poems to married ladies might sound like the height of romance. In books it was. In real life, it was more like playing with fire while wearing straw clothes. The idea of courtly love, noble, pure, full of longing and polite suffering, was mostly a story told by poets who probably never had to answer to anyone's husband. It was a game with strict rules, played in secret, and almost never meant to be taken seriously. The lady was usually already married, often to someone powerful, and the knight's devotion was supposed to stay in the realm of sighs and verses. If it stepped into the real world, someone usually ended up hurt. These poems and songs were everywhere. A knight might spend weeks composing a ballad about the way his lady's hair caught the sunlight, or how her voice made birds forget to sing. He might dedicate it to her during a feast, with a bow and a dramatic pause. Everyone would clap. The husband might even smile. But behind the smiles there was always a quiet understanding. This was pretend, a kind of emotional theatre. If the knight actually believed his own words, people would start to worry. Not because they cared about the marriage, but because drama was bad for order, and order was everything. The husband, of course, was rarely the fool. He knew what was going on, but as long as no lines were crossed, no secret meetings, no children born with suspiciously familiar eyes, he would usually look away. It was a kind of polite madness, like letting someone dance on your roof, as long as they didn't break the tiles. The knight got to feel important. The lady got a little attention. The court got entertainment. And no one had to fight over anything real. But if things went too far, the consequences were sharp. A knight caught alone with a noble woman in a garden at night might lose his title, his land, or his life. The lady, if found guilty of more than just listening, could be locked away, sent to a convent, or publicly shamed. Her reputation would be ruined, and with it, her family's standing. Love in this world was not just personal, it was political. A single kiss could weaken an alliance, spark a feud, or give enemies something to use. So, people were careful, or at least they pretended to be. Women had the worst of it. A man could write 10 poems, stare dramatically, and still be called passionate. A woman who responded with even a small gesture, a handkerchief returned, a note kept too long, could be accused of encouraging sin. The double standard was not subtle. It was like saying one person could play with matches while the other stood in a barrel of gunpowder. The risk was never the same. There was also the problem of boredom. Life at court was full of rules, ceremonies, and long winters. People needed distractions. Love stories, real or imagined, were a favourite pastime. A rumour about a secret glance or a hidden letter could spread faster than a cold in a crowded hall. Servants listened, nobles gossiped, and soon the whole castle knew. The couple involved might not have done anything at all, but once the story was out, they were already guilty in the eyes of many. Reputation was fragile, and once cracked it rarely healed. Some knights took it seriously. They really believed in the idea of loving from afar, of being brave for the sake of a woman they would never touch. They fought in tournaments to win her favour, wore her colours, and tried to live by a higher code. But even they knew the limits. They did not expect marriage. They did not demand anything. Their love was a performance, a way to show they were noble, not just by birth but by action. It was not about the lady, it was about the image of her. And the ladies, some played along because it was flattering, others ignored it completely. A few might have felt something, but they knew better than to show it. A noblewoman's life was already tightly controlled. She had little say in her marriage, her home, or her future. Adding a scandal to that was like pouring rain into a leaking boat. It solved nothing and made everything worse. The church, of course, disapproved of most of it. Love outside marriage was sin. Even thoughts could count if they were too strong. Priests reminded people that earthly passion was temporary, while divine love lasted forever. But since divine love didn't write poems or look good in tournaments, most people kept coming back to the earthly kind. They just made sure to keep it quiet, or at least quiet enough. There was a kind of humour in how everyone pretended not to see what was happening. At feasts, knights would gaze at ladies across the hall. Ladies would glance back just for a second. The music would play, the wine would flow, and everyone would act as if nothing unusual was going on. Meanwhile, the real business, politics, money, war, continued in the background. Love was decoration, a ribbon on a sword. Nice to look at, but not what won battles. And yet, despite the rules, the fear, the punishments, people still felt things. They looked into someone's eyes and forgot the script. They wrote poems they never sent. They remembered the way a hand moved or a laugh sounded. And for a moment, the game felt real. But then the moment passed. The knight returned to his duties, the lady to her husband, and the poem was folded and hidden, like a secret too small to change anything, but too heavy to throw away. It was never about changing the world. It was about surviving it with a little beauty left inside, a quiet rebellion, dressed as obedience, a feeling that refused to be fully silenced, not strong enough to win, but stubborn enough to stay. The church had strong opinions about love, mostly the kind that made people uncomfortable. It wasn't against love itself, at least not in theory, but it had very clear ideas about where and when it should happen. And more importantly, where and when it should not. Love between married people was acceptable, as long as it didn't get too enthusiastic. Love outside marriage was a problem. Love in the heart but not acted upon, still suspicious, love just thought about, could still be a sin, depending on the day and the priest. People were expected to control their feelings, especially the physical kind. Bodies were seen as tricky things, like horses that might bolt if not held tightly. A glance, a touch, a dream. All of these could lead down a dangerous path, and the church was always ready with a list of punishments. Confession was the first step, of course. You told the priest what you had done, or thought, or almost done. Then came the penance, prayers, fasting, walking barefoot to a shrine, or giving money to the poor, preferably the poor connected to the church. Some people took this seriously. Others saw it as a kind of tax. Sin, confess, pay, repeat. It was a system that worked well for everyone, except the truly guilty. And even they usually found a way out. A noble could pay for special prayers or go on a pilgrimage that looked impressive, but wasn't too hard. A peasant might have to stand in the churchyard for hours holding a candle, hoping their sins would melt away like the wax. The rules were the same for all, but the punishments always seemed to weigh heavier on those with less. Sex was the main concern, of course, not because the church enjoyed talking about it, quite the opposite, but because it was seen as powerful, unpredictable, and hard to control. A single night of passion could lead to a child, a scandal, or the end of a political marriage. So it was regulated like a dangerous animal, kept in a cage, fed only when necessary, and never allowed to run free. Marriage was the only approved cage, but even there, pleasure was not the goal. The goal was children, order, and avoiding sin. Enjoying it too much was frowned upon. A husband who loved his wife too much might be seen as weak. A wife who seemed too eager could be suspected of unnatural desires. The ideal was balance, enough to produce heirs, not enough to lose control. It was like cooking porridge, necessary, but best kept simple and plain. Confession was where most of the real talk happened. Behind the screen, people admitted things they would never say out loud. They confessed to thoughts, glances, dreams, moments of weakness. The priest listened, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with a sigh, and assigned a suitable punishment. The system was private, which helped, but it also meant that guilt was carried alone. No comfort, no discussion, just silence, and a list of prayers to say before bedtime. Women had a harder time here, as usual. A man might confess to a night with a servant and be told to say 10 prayers. A woman confessing the same thing could be given weeks of fasting, public penance, or even a warning about her soul. The message was clear. Men were expected to slip now and then. Women were expected to stay perfect, like a white dress in a muddy field. One stain, and the whole thing was ruined. There was also the problem of thoughts. The church believed that wanting to sin was almost as bad as doing it. A fantasy about someone else, even if never acted on, could still count. This made life difficult for anyone with a working imagination. You could not control who made your heart beat faster, but you were supposed to control what you did with that feeling. And if you failed, even in your head, you were still responsible. Some priests were kind, others used their power to make people nervous. A well-placed word could ruin a reputation. A rumour that someone was called in for a long confession might be enough to start gossip. And once gossip started, it was hard to stop. The church was supposed to offer mercy, but sometimes it felt more like a court that never closed. There was a kind of dark humour in how seriously people took sin. A man could kill in battle and be praised as a hero. But if he looked too long at a woman outside marriage, he might be told to pray for forgiveness for a month. Lust was treated like a national threat, while violence was just part of life. The priorities were clear, even if they made little sense. Still, the rules were followed mostly. People learned to hide their feelings, to look down, to avoid certain places and certain people. They married who they were told to marry. They stayed with them for better or worse. And if they dreamed of someone else, they kept it to themselves. Dreams were safe. As long as no one knew, they weren't real. And if they weren't real, they couldn't be punished. The church didn't invent all of this, of course. It worked with the world it had. A world where order mattered more than happiness, where reputation was everything, and where control over land, people, and bodies was the goal. Love, especially the kind that burned too bright, was not useful. It caused trouble. It made people act strangely. It weakened duty. So, it was managed, limited, watched. And yet, despite the fear, the guilt, the endless rules, people still felt things. They looked at someone and forgot to breathe. They remembered a voice, a smile, a hand. And in that moment, the church, the rules, the punishments, none of it mattered. The heart did not care about doctrine. It did not read the Bible. It just beat stubbornly against the silence. So people carried their secrets. They said their prayers. They lived their lives. And somewhere inside, beneath the guilt and the fear, a small part of them refused to stop feeling. Not because it was safe, but because it was human. Women in the Middle Ages didn't get a fair deal when it came to love. Their lives were shaped by rules that seemed to change the moment a man made a decision. A woman's worth was often measured by two things: her family's status and her purity. If she had both, she might be married well. If she lost one, especially the second, her future could collapse like a poorly built shed in a storm. Men could make mistakes, learn from them, and move on. Women were expected to be perfect from the start. Any slip, real or imagined, could follow them for life. Love outside marriage was dangerous for anyone, but for women, it was like walking through a field full of hidden traps. A single rumour could ruin everything. A kind word to the wrong person, a meeting that looked too private, even a dream mentioned in confession. All of it could be twisted into proof of wrongdoing. And once a woman was seen as loose, there was little she could do to fix it. Apologies didn't help. Truth didn't matter. Reputation was fragile, and once broken, it rarely healed. If a woman became pregnant outside marriage, her situation turned grim fast. She might be disowned by her family, thrown out of her home, or forced into a quick marriage with someone no one else wanted. The man involved, if he was of higher status, might not face any consequences at all. He could deny everything, blame her, or simply disappear. She was left holding the result, both literally and socially. The child might be seen as cursed, unwanted, or a burden. and the mother, she became a warning. A story told to other girls. This is what happens when you forget your place. Marriage was supposed to protect women, but often it just moved the danger from one place to another. A forced or unhappy marriage could be its own kind of prison. A husband could be cruel, jealous, or indifferent. He had legal control over her, her property, and even her body. Divorce was nearly impossible. Leaving meant losing everything: children, home, safety. So most stayed no matter how bad it got. Love in that case wasn't the problem. The lack of it was normal. The real problem was being trapped with someone who saw you as property, not a person. There was a kind of dark joke in how society treated women's emotions. A man could be passionate, wild, even reckless, and still be called brave or romantic. A woman showing the same feelings was called dangerous. Too much love made her suspicious. Too little made her cold. She was supposed to care deeply, but not too much. To be loyal, but not clingy. To be beautiful, but not tempting. It was a balance so delicate it was almost impossible to keep. Like trying to balance a spoon on your nose while walking on ice. Even love within marriage was watched closely. A wife who seemed too fond of her husband might be teased for being soft. But a wife who didn't seem to care could be accused of hiding something. Her feelings were never her own. They were part of the performance. She had to act the right way, say the right things, wear the right expression. If she failed, the fault was hers. The husband rarely got blamed for making life unbearable. Widows had a brief moment of freedom. With their husbands gone, they could manage their own land, make decisions, live as they pleased, for a while. But even that freedom came with pressure. Families would push them to remarry, often quickly, to keep property in the right hands. A woman enjoying her independence for too long was seen as unnatural, as if happiness without a man was a kind of rebellion. The church didn't help much. It taught that women were made from a man's rib, which somehow made them both part of men and slightly less than them. They were praised for modesty, silence, and obedience. Any sign of strong emotion, joy, anger, desire, was seen as a loss of control, and a woman who couldn't control herself was a threat to order. So she had to be controlled by someone else, usually a father, a husband, or a priest. There was a quiet bitterness in how little choice women had. They could be kind, hard-working, faithful, and still be judged by one mistake. A man could lie, cheat, abandon his family, and still be welcomed back with open arms. The world wasn't fair, but it was consistent. It always favoured the same people, and women, no matter how clever or strong, were rarely among them. Still, some women found ways to live on their own terms. A few ran businesses, managed estates, or became healers known across villages. Others used silence, patience, or careful words to protect themselves. A well-placed compliment, a quiet refusal, a sudden illness at the wrong time. These were small weapons in a life with few options. They didn't change the system, but they helped some survive it. And love? Some women learned to stop expecting it. They saw it as a luxury, like sugar in a poor household, nice but not necessary. They focused on duty, children, faith. They built lives that worked, even if they didn't sparkle. Others still hoped, quietly, in corners of their hearts no one could reach. They remembered a voice, a look, a moment before the world closed in. And in that memory, they found something warm, something real. It wasn't much, but in a world that gave them so little, even a small feeling could feel like freedom. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't just a personal matter. It could start wars. Not because anyone wanted to fight over a kiss, but because love tangled with power, land, and pride. Marriages were often peace treaties in disguise. Two families would agree to join through marriage to stop fighting, share resources, or strengthen their position. If someone fell in love with the wrong person, it wasn't just awkward. It could undo years of careful planning. A single romance could break an alliance, insult a lord, or give enemies a reason to strike. Imagine a lord's daughter promised to the son of a rival family. The deal is done. The land borders are settled. The peace is holding. Then the daughter meets a young knight from a third family and suddenly finds him very interesting. She smiles too long. He writes a poem. Someone sees. Gossip spreads. The rival family feels insulted. They think the engagement is being ignored. Tensions rise. The wedding is delayed. And before anyone knows it, both sides are gathering soldiers. Not for love, but because no one wants to look weak. Politics ran on predictability. Love, by its nature, was unpredictable. It didn't care about treaties or borders. It didn't understand the importance of not upsetting the neighbour who controls the only bridge. So, when love showed up where it wasn't invited, it was treated like a storm in the harvest season. Dangerous, messy, and best avoided. People didn't fall in love for fun. They did it at their own risk and often at the risk of others. There are stories, not many but enough, of real conflicts sparked by love. A nobleman who took another man's wife, even if she went willingly, wasn't just breaking hearts, he was breaking loyalty. That kind of act could lead to bloodshed. Not because of jealousy, but because it showed disrespect to an alliance. In a world where trust was rare and power was everything, disrespect was a challenge. And challenges were answered with swords, not apologies. Even kings weren't safe from this. A royal romance could shake the entire kingdom. If a prince fell for a commoner, the court would panic. Not because they hated love, but because they feared change. A commoner in the royal circle could upset the balance. Other nobles might feel threatened. Foreign powers might see weakness. And so the relationship would be quietly ended. The commoner sent away. The prince married off to someone suitable. And the whole thing buried like an old bone no one wants to dig up. Sometimes love was used as a weapon. A lord might spread a rumour that his enemy's wife was in love with a foreign knight, just to cause trouble. No proof needed. The doubt was enough. Trust was fragile, and once cracked it rarely healed. A husband might turn against his allies. A wife might be locked away. And the real enemy? He would be sipping wine and watching the chaos from a distance. There was a kind of dark comedy in how seriously people took these situations. A man could murder 5 people in battle and be called a hero, but if he exchanged letters with a married woman, he might be declared an outlaw. The first act was normal. The second was a threat to order. Society didn't mind violence as long as it was official. But private feelings? Those were dangerous. They couldn't be controlled, taxed, or predicted. And what couldn't be controlled made people nervous. Alliances were built on cold logic, not warm hearts. A good match meant stronger defences, better trade, or a safer border. Love had no place in that calculation. It was like trying to use a spoon to build a wall. The tool was wrong for the job. So, when love did interfere, it was seen as sabotage. Not romantic, not sweet, but damaging. Like a rat chewing through the ropes of a ship. Some rulers tried to control even the love lives of their subjects. A king might forbid marriages between certain families, or ban nobles from courting women from rival regions. These rules weren't about happiness, they were about stability. The fewer surprises, the better. And love, again, was full of surprises. There was also the problem of inheritance. If a noble fell in love with someone from a different line, it could confuse who would get the land, the title, the money. A child born from such a union might have a claim, and claims led to disputes. Disputes led to conflict. Conflict led to war. So love wasn't just a private risk, it was a public one. A single heart could, in theory, bring down a kingdom. Not because it was strong, but because it was careless. People knew this. They saw the stories, heard the warnings, watched what happened to those who ignored the rules. And most of them learned to keep their feelings quiet. To look away. To marry the right person. Say the right words. Live the right life. Not because they wanted to, but because the cost of not doing so was too high. And yet, some still tried. They wrote letters in secret. They met in gardens after dark. They dreamed of running away, but even their dreams were dangerous. Because in a world where peace depended on who married whom, love wasn't just risky, it was political. It wasn't just about two people. It was about families, land, power, and the fragile balance that held everything together. So love was not just discouraged, it was watched, it was suspected, it was silenced. Not because it was weak, but because it was too strong for the world it lived in. Life in the village was simpler than at court, but not easier when it came to love. Peasants didn't have titles or grand alliances to worry about, but they still lived under rules. The village was a small world, where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed secret for long. A glance held too long, a hand brushed during harvest, a note passed behind the barn. All of it could start a rumour. And in a place where reputation meant work, marriage, and survival, a rumour could be dangerous. Marriages among peasants were usually arranged by families, not kings, but the reasons were similar. Land, work, and stability. A farmer needed someone to help with the animals, the crops, the house. A woman needed someone to protect her and share the burden. Love was not the point. It was a bonus, like finding an extra egg in the nest. If two people liked each other, that was fine. But if they didn't, life went on. They still had to work, eat, and survive the winter. Still, people felt things. A young man might notice the way a girl tied her hair or laughed at a bad joke. A girl might like how a man worked quietly, without boasting. These small feelings could grow, even in a world that didn't encourage them, but acting on them was risky. If a couple met in secret, someone would likely see. And once seen, the story would spread. The priest might mention it in a sermon. The parents would step in, and the romance would end, not with a fight, but with silence and shame. Punishments weren't always harsh, but they were effective. A man caught kissing a married woman might be forced to stand in the churchyard with a sign or pay a fine in grain or chickens. A woman who was seen too often with a man, not her husband, might be called names, avoided at market, or scolded publicly. The goal wasn't just to punish, it was to warn others. The message was clear. Step out of line and you won't just suffer, you'll be seen suffering. The village priest played a big role. He was not just a spiritual guide, but a kind of judge and gossip keeper. He heard confessions, gave advice, and reminded people of their duties. If someone was causing trouble, he might speak to them quietly, or not so quietly. A word from the priest could change how people acted, not because they always believed in God, but because they believed in not being shamed. Children born outside marriage were a problem, not because the village hated them. Many grew up just fine, but because they were a sign that rules had been broken. The mother might be teased, the father might be pressured to marry her, and the family might carry the mark for years. Still, compared to the nobility, peasants had a little more room to breathe. A quick marriage could fix many things. A child could be accepted if the parents stayed together. And if no one made a fuss, the story might fade in time. There was a kind of rough fairness into how things were handled. A noble who did the same thing might not be punished at all, but a peasant would pay. Still, the punishment fit the world. In a place where everyone depended on each other, trust and order mattered. If people started ignoring the rules, who would help at harvest? Who would lend tools? Who would stand by you in a dispute? Love was personal, but its effects were not. It could weaken the whole village if it caused division. Some couples tried to escape. They'd pack a few things and leave at night, hoping to start over in another village. But life on the road was hard. Without family, without land, without a name, they were nobodies. They couldn't prove who they were. They couldn't claim rights. They were treated with suspicion, like stray dogs. And if they were caught, the return was worse than staying. The man might be beaten. The woman might be married off immediately to someone older, someone stricter, as a lesson. Still, there was more freedom in small things. A man could walk a woman home after church. They could sit together at a feast. They could dance as long as it wasn't too close. These small moments were allowed, even encouraged, as long as they led to a proper marriage. The village didn't hate love, it just wanted it in the right place, at the right time, with the right person. There was also humour in how seriously people took courtship. A man bringing a basket of apples to a woman's door wasn't declaring passion, he was applying for a job, and everyone knew it. The parents would inspect the apples, the man's boots, his teeth. Was he strong, reliable, free of disease? Love was in the background, like music at a fair, nice but not the main event. And yet, despite the rules, the gossip, the fear, people still found ways to connect. A shared look during mass, a hand brushing while passing bread, a quiet word in the stable. These tiny moments meant something. They couldn't change the world, but they made it softer. They reminded people that behind the duties, the work, the silence, there was still a heart that could beat for someone else. The village didn't reward love, but it couldn't fully stop it either. It was too small for complete control, too human for perfect order. So, love stayed, quiet, hidden, but present. Like roots under the soil, growing where no one could see. Love in the Middle Ages often found a safe place where it wasn't supposed to, in poetry. While real romance could get people killed, imprisoned or shamed, writing about it was not only allowed, it was celebrated. Poets, minstrels and wandering singers filled the courts and villages with songs of impossible love, tragic longing and noble suffering. These stories didn't change the world, but they gave people something to dream about while churning butter or mending boots. The idea was simple. If you couldn't live love, you could at least sing about it. And sing people did. Knights wrote verses about ladies they had never spoken to. Troubadours travelled from town to town, telling tales of secret meetings, stolen glances and hearts broken by duty. The more dramatic, the better. A love that could never be was the most beautiful kind. It didn't cause problems. It didn't break marriages. It didn't start wars. It just existed, in words, in music, in the quiet space between reality and fantasy. This was not hypocrisy. It was survival. People needed beauty, even if it was fake. They needed hope, even if it was about someone else's life. A servant listening to a ballad about a forbidden romance wasn't planning to rebel. She was just letting her mind wander for a moment. A knight singing about eternal devotion wasn't lying. He was playing a role. Like an actor in a play, no one wanted to end. The church didn't mind this much. As long as the love stayed in the song, it wasn't dangerous. A poem about a married woman could be called art. The same action in real life would be called sin. The difference was not in the feeling, but in the consequence. Art had no consequences. It didn't produce children, ruin alliances, or make husbands jealous. It just floated in the air, like smoke, noticeable, but harmless. There was a kind of irony in how freely people could talk about love in poems while being punished for feeling it in real life. A man could write 100 verses about kissing a noblewoman and be praised as talented. But if he actually tried it, he might lose his tongue, literally or figuratively. The world loved the idea of love as long as it stayed an idea. Once it became real, it became a threat. Still, these stories had power. They shaped how people thought about love. They made it seem noble, painful, and worth suffering for. They taught that true love was rare, pure, and usually ended in tragedy. This wasn't helpful for arranged marriages, but it gave people a kind of emotional language. If you couldn't say, "I love you," you could sigh at the moon and hope someone noticed. Women especially found comfort in these tales. A lady stuck in a cold marriage could listen to a song about a knight dying for love and feel something warm inside. It wasn't escape exactly, more like a reminder that feelings were not wrong, just poorly timed. The song didn't help her situation, but it told her she wasn't alone. Somewhere, someone had felt the same. Even peasants enjoyed the stories. A farmer might not understand all the words in a nobleman's poem, but he could feel the sadness in the tune. A mother rocking a child might hum a ballad about lost love, not because she wanted to remember, but because the melody fit the quiet of the evening. These songs were not just entertainment, they were a way to carry emotions that had no place in daily life. There was also humour in how exaggerated the stories often were. A knight might claim he would walk through fire, fight 10 dragons, or give up his soul, all for a woman who barely knew his name. No one believed it, but everyone enjoyed it. It was like watching a storm from behind a window, exciting but safe. The more impossible the love, the more people liked it. Reality was hard enough. Fantasy didn't need to be realistic. Some rulers even encouraged the poetry. A king might host a contest for the most beautiful love song, not because he cared about romance, but because it kept people busy and happy. A court full of poets was less likely to plot rebellion. A village listening to music was less likely to argue over land. Art, in this way, was useful. It calmed minds, softened hearts, and distracted from real problems. And yet, despite the safety of poetry, it still carried a quiet rebellion. Every song about forbidden love was a tiny protest against the world's rules. Not loud, not violent, just a whisper. What if it could be different? It didn't change laws. It didn't free anyone. But it kept the idea alive that love could matter more than duty, more than status, more than fear. So, people sang. They listened, they sighed. And in that moment, they were not peasants, servants, or lords. They were just human, aching, hoping, remembering. The song would end. The work would return. The rules would stay. But for a little while, something soft had been allowed in. And that was enough. Running away in the Middle Ages was not a romantic idea. It was a desperate one. The world outside the village or the estate was not kind to strangers. There were no maps, no safe inns, and no guarantees. A couple fleeing love might dream of a quiet life in a new place, but the reality was usually hunger, cold, and fear. Roads were dangerous. Forests were full of thieves. Towns asked for proof of status, and without it, you were nobody. Most runaways didn't get far. A pair might leave at night, carrying only bread and a cloak. By morning, someone would notice they were gone. If they were important, a search might begin. If not, the village would just shrug and carry on. But even unnoticed, life on the road was hard. Without family, there was no help in sickness. Without land, there was no food. Without a name, there was no trust. Some couples tried to pass as married. They would arrive in a new village and say they came from far away. No one could prove otherwise, but small mistakes gave them away. An accent, a wrong name, a lack of knowledge about local customs. Suspicion was easy to earn. Strangers were always watched, and if the truth came out, the punishment could be harsh. The man might be whipped or forced into service. The woman might be returned to her family or married off immediately to someone else. As a lesson, there was a kind of irony in how freedom felt like punishment. To escape one prison, they entered another. The prison of being unwanted. A runaway was not free. He was hunted, poor and tired. A runaway woman was seen as damaged, disobedient, and dangerous. Her value dropped like a stone in water. And even if they found a place to stay, they lived in fear. Not just of being caught, but of being discovered as liars, outcasts, or sinners. Some did survive. A few couples found remote villages where no one asked too many questions. They worked hard, kept quiet, and never mentioned their past. They built lives from nothing, with no celebrations, no grand love stories, just survival. And in that silence, they sometimes found something real. Not the passion of poems, but the quiet warmth of two people who chose each other and stayed. But these cases were rare. Most runaways were caught or gave up. The world was too small, too watchful, too unforgiving. Love was not a strong enough reason to break the rules. It didn't feed you, shelter you, or protect you. It just made you weak at the wrong time. There was also the problem of money. A noble couple might have coins to last a few weeks. A peasant couple had nothing. They couldn't buy food, pay for shelter, or bribe a guard. They depended on charity, which was limited and often came with conditions. A meal might require work. A bed might mean cleaning stables or hearing a long sermon. And if winter came, charity dried up. The coal didn't care about love. Families rarely helped. A father who had arranged a marriage would not let his daughter run off with a servant. A mother would not support her son, leaving for a woman of lower status. The family name, the land, the future, all of it was more important than personal happiness. So runaways were on their own. No support, no advice, no safety net. And yet, some still tried. They believed that love was worth the risk, that a life together, even a hard one, was better than a safe life apart. They held hands in the dark and whispered promises they couldn't keep. They walked for days with sore feet and empty stomachs. They slept under trees, shivering, hoping the next town would be kinder. Most failed. But the fact that they tried said something. It said that even in a world built on duty, fear and control, the heart still beat its own way. It didn't care about borders, laws or reputation. It just wanted to be near someone. And sometimes that want was stronger than sense, stronger than safety, stronger than silence. So the runaways became legends. Not in books, but in quiet stories told by firelight. A man and a woman who disappeared. A note found on a windowsill. A rumour of a cottage in the woods. No proof, no happy ending, just the idea that somewhere someone chose love over order. And for a moment, that was enough. Love in the Middle Ages was not supposed to win. It was not meant to be loud, free, or easy. It was supposed to stay quiet, in the corners, behind closed doors, in the space between duty and silence. And yet, it never fully disappeared. People still looked at each other in ways they shouldn't. They still remembered voices, touches, moments that meant too much. They still felt things they were not allowed to name. The world was built on order, not emotion. Kings ruled, priests guided, peasants worked, and everyone stayed in their place. Love, with its messy unpredictability, didn't fit. It made people do foolish things. It made them question. It made them want more than their station. And in a world where most had little, wanting more was dangerous. And yet, love survived. Not as a victory, but as a whisper. A note passed in secret. A hand held too long at harvest. A poem burned before it could be read. These were not acts of rebellion with banners and shouts. They were small, quiet, almost invisible, but they were there. Proof that even under rules, fear and silence, something soft could still grow. People fell in love, despite the cost. They did it knowing they might lose everything. Family, status, safety. They did it not because it was smart, but because it felt true. Because for a moment, the weight of the world lifted, and all that mattered was the person in front of them. Because sometimes the heart refused to follow the rules, even when the body obeyed. The church warned of sin. The lords demanded loyalty. The village watched for shame. But none of that could fully stop a glance that lingered, a memory that refused to fade, a feeling that bloomed in the dark. Love was not strong enough to change laws or end wars, but it was strong enough to make someone smile on a cold morning, strong enough to make a person feel seen, even in silence. There was a kind of quiet power in that, not the power of armies or gold, but the power of a single moment that felt real. A shared look across a crowded hall, a name whispered at night, a child born from a love that was never approved but never forgotten. These were not triumphs, but they were not nothing, and perhaps that was the point. Love in the Middle Ages was never about winning. It was about surviving, quietly, secretly, stubbornly. It was about finding warmth in a world that offered little. About choosing someone even if you could never say it out loud. About remembering, even when forgetting was safer. People still married for duty. They still obeyed their families. They still lived by the rules. But somewhere inside, many carried a small flame. fed by a voice, a face, a dream. It didn't light the world, it didn't change the system, but it kept them human, so love remained. Not in grand declarations or happy endings, but in silence, in memory, in the quiet choice to feel something real. It was dangerous, it was punished, it was hidden, but it was never gone. After all, even in the coldest winter, even in the darkest time, even under the heaviest rule, life finds a way. And love, for all its risks, was still a part of life. Not the loudest part, not the safest, but one of the most human. And that, in the end, was enough. She was born in the 1910s when the world still believed that a girl's future could be neatly folded and stored in a drawer marked suitable. Her parents lived in a small house near the coast, where the sea didn't roar so much as sigh, long, slow breaths against the shingle. Most people in the town measured their lives by tides and fishing seasons. Dreams were practical things: a steady job, a warm kitchen, children who didn't wander too far. But from the beginning, she wasn't interested in staying close. When she was 5, she found a smooth black stone on the beach and asked her father what it was. He said, "Just a bit of rock, love. Toss it back." She didn't. She kept it in her pocket for weeks, then added another and another, until her coat was heavy with them. She lined them up on the windowsill, sorted by colour, shape, weight. Her mother called it a phase. The neighbours said she was odd. One old woman told her, "You'll never catch a husband with a pocket full of gravel." She looked at the woman, then at her stones, and decided that catching husbands was less interesting than knowing where rocks came from. At school, she liked maps, not the ones showing cities and roads, but the ones with squiggly lines and numbers, contour lines, though she didn't know the word yet. She would stare at them for hours, imagining hills rising and falling beneath her feet. The teacher once caught her redrawing a map of Europe during arithmetic. "Why are you wasting time on that?" the teacher asked. "It's already been made," she said. "I wanted to see if I could do it better." The teacher wasn't amused. She was sent to the corner with a dictionary and told to look up obedience. She looked up geography instead. Her father wasn't a clever man, not in the way books measure cleverness. He worked in a warehouse, came home tired, and rarely spoke much at dinner. But he noticed things. He saw how she looked at the cliffs when they walked by the sea, how she picked up broken shells and turned them over like puzzles. One birthday, he gave her a book, a child's guide to the earth. It was old, the cover peeling, probably bought for a few pence at a market. Inside were pictures of volcanoes, glaciers, and the layers of the planet, like a cake no one could eat. She read it until the pages fell out. The world around her didn't encourage curiosity, especially not in girls. At church, the vicar said women were made to guide, not to lead. At the library, the assistant raised an eyebrow when she asked for books on rocks. "Are you sure you don't want something lighter? A novel, perhaps?" she said. "This is light enough. It doesn't weigh more than a brick." The woman didn't laugh, but she handed over the book. She didn't set out to change science. She just didn't see why the rules should apply to her. When her classmates giggled about boys and hair ribbons, she doodled cross-sections of mountains in the margins of her notebook. When her aunt said, "You'll grow out of this nonsense," she replied, "I hope not. I'm not very good at gardening." There was no anger in her voice, just a quiet certainty that she was built for something else. One day, during a school trip to a quarry, the teacher warned the children not to wander off. "The ground isn't safe," he said. "It could collapse." She looked down and saw layers in the rock face, stripes of grey, brown and rust, like pages in a book that had been slammed shut. While the others threw pebbles into the water below, she crouched and touched the stone. It was cold, rough, real. She thought, "This has been here longer than people, longer than houses, longer than rules." No one noticed her that day, but she noticed everything. Later, She would be told that women couldn't lead expeditions, couldn't interpret sonar, couldn't possibly understand the deep ocean. Men would say these things with the confidence of men who had never spent an afternoon talking to a cliff. But she had already learned the most important lesson, that the earth didn't care about titles or gender, or who had a degree and who didn't. It just was. And if you were quiet enough, patient enough, it would tell you things. Even then, as a child with muddy shoes and a head full of questions, she understood one thing better than most adults ever would. That discovery doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it begins with a girl, a rock, and the simple refusal to throw it back. And if someone had told her then that one day her name would be mentioned, quietly, reluctantly, often without credit, in the same breath as the greatest scientific breakthroughs of the century, she might have smiled. Or not. She wasn't one for drama. She'd probably just have gone back to her stones. University was a grey stone building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated joy. It stood at the edge of a town that smelled of rain and old books, and it welcomed her with a notice on the door. No admittance for women in the geology lecture hall without prior approval. She knocked anyway. The man who answered wore a tie that hadn't been fashionable since the war, and a look that said he'd been expecting trouble. She told him her name and that she'd been accepted, barely, after a letter from her head mistress calling her determined if misguided. He checked a list, sighed as if personally wronged, and let her in, muttering something about setting a bad precedent. The lecture hall was full. Rows of men in dark jackets, pens at the ready, hair neatly combed as if seriousness could be measured by parting. She took a seat in the front, the only woman in sight. A few turned to look. One dropped his notebook. Another whispered something that made his friend snort into his elbow. She didn't flinch. She opened her book, placed her pencil carefully on the page, and waited. The professor arrived late, as if to prove he was important, and began speaking about igneous rocks as though they were the most thrilling thing in the world. She listened. She took notes. She underlined things. After the first week, a rumour started. The girl in the front row had corrected the professor. It wasn't true, not exactly. What happened was, he'd pointed to a diagram of a volcano and said the lava came from the Earth's core. She'd raised her hand and said, "Isn't it from the mantle?" He'd paused, blinked, then said, "Well, yes, technically," and moved on. But by lunchtime, the story had changed. Now she'd shouted at him. Now she'd challenged his entire career. Now she was dangerous. She didn't care. She kept coming. She studied in the library when it was too cold to stay in her rented room. She borrowed books no one else wanted. The physical structure of the ocean crust, seismic waves in sedimentary layers, and read them by candlelight. The other students formed groups, met in pubs, talked over pints about fieldwork and fossils. She worked alone. When invited once, "Come on, even girls need a break," she went. They sat at a table, laughing too loudly, and someone said, "So what's a clever girl like you doing in geology? Planning to marry a professor?" She looked at him and said, "I was planning to drink my lemonade, but thanks for the career advice." They didn't invite her again. Field trips were worse. The department allowed her to attend, but only if she stayed behind the group. Only if she didn't touch the rocks unless given permission. Only if she didn't disturb the natural workflow. On one trip to the Welsh hills, it rained for 3 days straight. The men huddled under tarps, complaining about their boots. She walked ahead, collecting samples, her coat soaked, her hands numb. When she pointed out a fault line in the rock face, clear as a crack in a window, the group leader said, "Very observant, now go and make tea." She didn't argue. She made the tea. Then she wrote down everything she'd seen, in her own notebook, in her own words. One evening, after a particularly dull lecture on mineral classification, a senior student stopped her in the corridor. He was tall, confident, the kind of man who believed his voice carried authority just by existing. You know, he said, most people think women lack the spatial reasoning for geology. It's not personal. She looked at him. Right. And I suppose men have a natural gift for it, like dogs do for fetching sticks? He frowned. That's not what she cut in. If you're trying to tell me I don't belong, just say it. Saves time. He didn't reply. He walked away, possibly in search of someone easier to patronize. Still, she passed her exams. Not just passed, topped the year. The results were posted on a board outside the department office. A crowd gathered. Someone said, "No, that can't be right." Another said, "She must have cheated." A professor, one of the few who hadn't openly mocked her, looked at the list and said quietly, "Well, that's awkward." Her name was first. No asterisk, no note saying, "Female candidate." Just her name, bold and plain. No one congratulated her. No one offered to celebrate. But the next lecture, the professor paused before speaking and said, "Before we begin, I'd like to note that someone in this room scored higher than any student in the past 10 years. Let that be a reminder that effort matters more than opinion." He didn't look at her, but he didn't have to. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and a little sad, not for herself, but for the world that had to be dragged, kicking and muttering, into basic fairness. Still, she kept going. She wrote her thesis on underwater geological formations, something no one had studied properly, mostly because no one could see them. Her supervisor read it and said, "Interesting. But how can you map what you can't observe?" She said, "Same way you learn about anything you've never seen. You look at the evidence and stop pretending it's not there." He gave her a mark, but not a compliment. Graduation day came and went. She stood in line with the others, in a gown too big for her, listening to speeches about progress and tradition. No one mentioned her by name. No one pointed her out. When it was over, she walked back to her room, took off the gown, and packed her books. She had a degree. It didn't change how the world saw her. But it was a tool, and she had learned by now that tools didn't need applause. They just needed to be used. Later, she would realise that university hadn't taught her geology so much as it had taught her patience. The patience to be ignored. The patience to work twice as hard for half the recognition. The patience to believe in something simply because the numbers said it was true, even when every man in the room said it wasn't. And if anyone had told her then that one day people would call her stubborn, she would have agreed, but she'd have added, quietly, that being stubborn was the only thing that kept her from giving up, or throwing a rock at someone's head. She wasn't violent, but the thought had crossed her mind. After graduation, she found herself in a room full of filing cabinets, dust, and the faint smell of boiled cabbage. The job was at a small research institute, one of those quiet places that existed mostly to give men with minor academic ambitions a place to nap between meetings. She had applied for fieldwork, for ocean surveys, for anything that involved actual science. Instead, she was hired as a research assistant, which in practice meant she was expected to type other people's notes, make tea, and not speak unless asked. The man who interviewed her, round-faced with a moustache that twitched when he lied, had said, "We value precision here, and discretion." She wasn't sure what he meant by discretion, but she assumed it involved not pointing out his mistakes. Her desk was in a corner, near a window that didn't open, and a radiator that hissed like a disapproving aunt. The other staff, 6 men all older, all with titles like Senior Observer or Assistant Director, barely acknowledged her. When they did, it was to ask where the ink was, or if she'd finished transcribing Dr. Hemsworth's lecture on sediment layers. She had, twice. The first version had a typo on page 7. They made her do it again. She didn't complain. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there to learn. And slowly, quietly, she began to notice things. The Institute had been collecting ocean depth measurements for years, mostly from naval ships that had recorded soundings during wartime patrols. The data was considered routine. useful for navigation, not science. Most of it sat in boxes labelled miscellaneous, hydrography, and forgotten, but she asked to see it. The head of the department, a man who wore waistcoats with too many buttons, looked at her over his glasses and said, "Why? It's just numbers," she said. "So is a phone book. Doesn't mean it's not useful." He blinked as if she'd broken a rule by being clever, but eventually handed over a folder. That night, she stayed late. The building emptied by 5:30. By 6, she was alone. The only light in the room coming from her desk lamp and the glow of a street lamp outside. She spread the data across the table, columns of numbers, each representing a depth taken at a specific point in the Atlantic. To most people, it would have looked like a shopping list written by a drunk. To her, it was a language. She began plotting the points on a grid, marking depths with dots. Deeper spots got lower marks, shallower ones higher. Slowly, a shape began to emerge, not flat, not random, a long, winding ridge running north to south, with a valley down the middle. She frowned. That wasn't supposed to happen. Everyone knew the ocean floor was mostly flat, a vast plain of mud and silence. This looked more like a spine, like the earth had a backbone under the water. She checked the data again, then again. She found errors, misrecorded depths, typos in coordinates, but even after correcting them, the shape remained. She tried plotting a different section. Same thing. Another ridge, another valley. She sat back, rubbed her eyes, and thought, well, that's odd. The next day, she mentioned it to one of the senior men, a doctor, Pritchard, who spent most of his time writing letters to journals about the erosion patterns of British cliffs. There seems to be a pattern in the Atlantic soundings, she said. A continuous, underwater mountain range, more or less down the centre. He didn't look up from his letter. Oh, probably just a fault line. Nothing significant. She said, it stretches thousands of miles. It's not a fault, it's a feature. He finally glanced at her. You've been spending too long with those numbers. They'll play tricks on you, like staring at clouds and seeing faces. She didn't argue. She went back to her desk. Later, she overheard two of the men talking in the corridor. She's mapping fairy tales, one said. The other laughed. Next, she'll be charting Atlantis. She didn't react. But that evening she took the data home. Not all of it, just enough to keep working. Her landlady, Mrs. Gable, found her at the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by papers. You'll ruin your eyes, the woman said. And what for? No one's going to thank you, she said. Maybe not. But I'd like to know what's down there. Mrs. Gable shook her head. You and your rocks. At least the moon stays where it is. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Not yet. She just couldn't ignore what the numbers were saying. The ocean floor wasn't dead. It wasn't flat. It was alive with shape, with movement, with history. And no one was looking. The Institute had a large map of the world on the wall in the main hall, painted, slightly faded, the kind used to impress visiting dignitaries. Oceans were blank, painted a calm, featureless blue. One day she stood in front of it and thought, that's a lie. Not a deliberate one, perhaps, but a lie all the same, because underneath that calm blue, something huge was happening, and the only person who seemed to care was the woman they'd hired to type up reports. She started making her own maps, not on proper paper. She wasn't allowed that. She used old survey sheets, the backs of discarded forms, even wrapping paper from a parcel that arrived for someone else. She drew the ridge, shaded the depths, added notes in the margins. She didn't sign them. She didn't show them around. She just kept going. One afternoon, the head of the department walked past her desk and saw the sketches. He paused, peered at them, then said, Bit of a hobby, is it? She said, something like that. He chuckled. Charming, like a child's drawing. Then he walked off, adjusting his tie as if he'd just won a point. She didn't mind. Let them think it was a hobby. Let them think she was harmless. Hobbies didn't threaten anyone. Hobbies didn't win arguments, but hobbies could wait. And they could grow. Years later, someone would ask her why she hadn't fought harder in those early days. Why she hadn't demanded attention, shouted her findings, gone public, she would say, because no one listens to quiet women, so I let them ignore me while I did the work. And if she added just once, with the faintest edge of sarcasm, besides, it gave me more time to be right, well, that was between her and the truth. The war ended, and the Navy began releasing old data, sonar readings, depth soundings, navigation logs, from ships that had sailed across the Atlantic and Pacific. Most of it was meant for safety. Avoid underwater cliffs. Don't run aground. Keep submarines from bumping into things. No one thought it could be used for science. No one, that is, except the woman in the corner, with the pencil and the too small desk. She got hold of the new files by accident, or not quite accident. She saw a box marked Atlantic Survey, restricted, left open on a senior researcher's desk while he went to lunch. She didn't steal it. She just didn't close the door properly when she walked past. Later, when the office was quiet, she sat down with it. The pages were full of lines and numbers printed in thin blue ink. Sonar echoes, time delays, depth calculations. To most it was noise. To her, it was music. She spent weeks copying it by hand. Not because she didn't trust the originals, though she didn't, not really, but because she liked to feel the data as she wrote it. Each number was a step. Each dot on her grid was a footprint. Slowly, the shape came back. The long ridge, the central valley, the symmetry on either side. But now it was clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. She began to suspect something strange. The rock on either side of the valley wasn't just similar, it was mirrored, like someone had taken a knife and split the seafloor in two, then pushed the halves apart. That didn't make sense. Nothing on Earth just split open and moved. Or at least, that's what the textbooks said. The textbooks also said the Earth was static, that continents didn't wander, that mountains formed slowly and quietly. She had read those books. She just didn't believe them anymore. One evening, she spread her latest map across the floor of her rented room. It was made from 4 pieces of brown wrapping paper taped together, covered in pencil lines, shaded depths, tiny notes in the margins. She stood back and looked at it. From a distance, it looked like a wound, a long, deep cut running through the ocean, with something rising up from the middle. She stared at it for a long time. Then she said, out loud, "Well, you're not supposed to be there, are you?" The next day, she showed a small section to a visiting geophysicist, a man from America who actually asked her opinion. She didn't hand him a finished map. She wasn't that naive. She gave him a clean, simple plot of depth readings across the mid-Atlantic. He studied it. "Huh," he said. "That's a rift valley." She said, "Yes. And the ridge on either side. Look at the symmetry." He frowned. "That's odd." She didn't say, "I've been saying that for years." She just said, "It's consistent across thousands of miles." He nodded slowly. "Someone should look into this." She didn't point out that someone already had. Back at the institute, nothing changed. The men still talked about rocks they could see, not ones buried under miles of water. They still handed her stacks of papers to file, still asked her to fetch tea during meetings. One afternoon, Dr. Hemsworth walked past her desk and glanced at her latest sketch. "Still playing with your underwater hills?" he said. She said, "They're not hills, they're mountains, bigger than the Alps." He laughed. "Well, as long as you don't expect us to believe it." She didn't reply. But that night, she added a label to her map, in small neat letters, Mid-Atlantic Ridge. She didn't invent the name, but she was the first to draw it properly. The first to show its full length, its depth, its strange central crack. She didn't shout about it. She didn't write a paper titled, "I have discovered something important." She just kept working. She knew no one would take her seriously if she acted like she was changing the world. So she acted like she was just tidying up. Like this was just another project, like she wasn't slowly redrawing the face of the planet. Sometimes she caught herself smiling. Not because she was happy, though there was a quiet satisfaction in being right, but because of how blind everyone else was. These men, with their degrees and their titles, walking around as if they understood the earth, when they hadn't even looked at half of it. The ocean covered 70% of the planet, and they treated it like a swimming pool with bad lighting. She once overheard two senior staff members talking about a new theory, continental drift. One said, "Ridiculous. Continents don't move. That's like saying your house gets up and walks to the next street." The other said, "Exactly. Only a madman or a German would believe that." She said nothing, but later she looked at her map and thought, well, the ocean floor is moving, whether you believe it or not. She began to wonder if the ridge wasn't just a mountain range, but a factory, a place where new seafloor was being born, pushed up from below, then spreading outward like a conveyor belt. If that were true, it could explain the symmetry, the rift, the way the rock got older the farther you moved from the centre. It was a wild idea, a dangerous idea. It meant the earth was alive, shifting, changing. Not a solid ball, but a restless thing. She tested the thought against the data, again and again. It fit, not perfectly, nothing did, but well enough to make her pulse quicken. She didn't tell anyone. What was the point? Last time she'd suggested something new, Dr. Pritchard had told her to stick to typing, so she kept her thoughts to herself. She drew her maps, she corrected errors in the data, she made tea when asked. One day, a young technician saw her working late and asked, "Why do you bother?" "No one's going to read it," she looked up. "I'm not doing it for them," she said. "I'm doing it because it's there." He didn't understand, but he didn't laugh. That was something. The truth she was learning didn't need an audience. It just needed to exist. And sometimes the best way to change the world was to sit quietly, with a pencil, and draw it the way it really was, while everyone else looked the other way. And if that made her a nuisance, a dreamer, a woman with too much time and too little sense, well, let them say it. She had a map to finish. She finished the map in the spring of 1957 on a Tuesday. It wasn't unveiled with music or speeches. No reporters came. No professors gathered to admire it. She simply stepped back from her desk, rubbed her neck, and looked at what she'd made. It covered nearly the entire wall of her office. 6 sheets of heavy paper, joined with tape and patience, filled with lines, numbers, and shaded contours. It showed the Atlantic Ocean, not as a flat, lifeless plain, but as a landscape. Deep trenches, towering ridges, a long snaking valley splitting the ocean, floor in two. At the centre, bold and undeniable, was the mid-ocean ridge, stretching from the Arctic to the Antarctic, like a spine running the length of the sea. She didn't feel triumphant, she felt tired, and a little strange, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and had just remembered to exhale. She called it the North Atlantic Floor, a composite map based on available soundings. The title was dull on purpose. She had learned by now that if you wanted men to take you seriously, you had to make your work look boring. Excitement was for boys with new toys. Women had to be careful not to seem too eager, too sure, too certain. So she gave them facts, neat lines, clear labels, no drama, just the earth, drawn as it was. She made 3 copies, one she kept, one she sent to a research library in the States. No note, no request for feedback, just her name and address in the corner. The 3rd she left on the desk of the Institute's director, under a paperweight shaped like a tiny volcano. He saw it the next morning. She watched from her desk as he stopped, frowned, turned to a colleague, and said, "Did we commission this?" The colleague squinted. "Looks like something from the typing pool." She didn't react, but later she heard him tell someone on the phone, "Oh, just a little project from our assistant. Harmless enough." Harmless. That was the word they used when they didn't want to admit they were wrong. A month later, she attended a small conference in London, not as a speaker, but as a support staff member. She wasn't listed in the programme. She wasn't introduced. She sat in the back, took notes, and handed out programmes when asked. One session was on oceanic geology. A well-known professor from Cambridge stood at the front speaking about recent discoveries in the Atlantic. He showed a slide, a simplified version of a ridge with a central valley. He called it a fascinating new feature and said it might hold clues to the Earth's deeper movements. She recognised the shape instantly. It was her map. Not exactly. Details had been smoothed, the scale altered, the precision softened, but the structure, the symmetry, the central rift was unmistakable. And there was no mention of her, no reference, no credit. She didn't stand up. She didn't shout. She just sat there, her hands in her lap, and thought, so this is how it's done. After the talk, a few people clapped. Someone called it groundbreaking. She walked to the tea table, poured herself a cup, and said nothing. A man she knew slightly, someone who had once asked her to check his daughter, came over and said, "You see that? Amazing, isn't it?" She said, "Yes, very." He didn't notice the flatness in her voice, or if he did, he chose not to. Later, she found out the professor had seen her paper in the obscure journal. He hadn't cited it. He hadn't written to her. He had simply taken the idea, dressed it in his own words, and presented it as his insight. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even unusual. In science, as in many things, credit often went to the loudest voice, not the first one. She wasn't angry. Not really. She had expected it. She had known, from the first day she sat at that desk, that this would happen. Women's work was like wallpaper. Everyone saw it, but no one noticed it was there until it was gone. But she didn't stop. She started again. She began mapping the Pacific, then the Indian Ocean. She worked with magnetic data now too, pulling in readings from research ships. She noticed something odd. The rock on either side of the ridge showed matching patterns of magnetism, like stripes on a zebra. The stripes were symmetrical. They repeated, and they got older the farther they moved from the centre. It was as if the sea floor was being born in the middle and pushed outward, like a slow conveyor belt. New rock rising up, spreading apart, carrying the continents with it. She didn't call it plate tectonics. That term hadn't been invented yet, but she saw what it meant. The earth wasn't still. It was moving, breathing, changing. She drew another map. This one showed the global ridge system, not just the Atlantic, but the one wrapping around the globe, through every ocean. She shaded the depths, marked the rifts, added notes in the margins. She didn't send it to a journal. She didn't expect it to be published. Instead, she gave copies to a few younger scientists, ones who asked questions, who didn't laugh at strange ideas. She didn't say, "This is mine." She just said, "You might find this useful." One of them did. A geophysicist from America, working on seafloor spreading, wrote to her months later. "Your maps were essential," he said. "We couldn't have made the connection without them." He didn't offer co-authorship. He didn't suggest her name for a prize, but he used her work. And slowly, quietly, her lines began to appear in textbooks, in lectures, in scientific papers, always without her name, always as data from various sources. She didn't mind. Not exactly. She knew the truth, and the truth, once drawn, couldn't be erased. Sometimes she would look at her original map, still taped to the wall, fading at the edges. She'd run a finger along the ridgeline and think, "You were there all along. I just had to see you." And if anyone had asked her whether it was worth it, the years of silence, the ignored papers, the stolen ideas, she would have said yes. Not because she wanted revenge or fame, but because the world now knew something it hadn't before. And if no one knew who had shown them, well, that was their problem. She had a pencil, she had paper, she had eyes that refused to look away. That was enough. By the early 1960s, the ground, quite literally, began to shift. Not just underfoot, but in the minds of those who studied it. The idea that the Earth's surface was not fixed, that continents drifted and oceans opened like wounds, went from being laughed at to being discussed in hushed, serious tones. A few bold scientists started using words like seafloor spreading and plate tectonics. Papers were published, conferences grew heated, old professors clung to their textbooks, younger ones scribbled equations on napkins, and somewhere in the middle of it all, quietly, without fanfare, the maps kept appearing. Not under her name, not with her photograph, but her lines, the ridge, the rift, the symmetrical patterns were there, in lecture halls, in research papers, in the margins of arguments. The data she had drawn, corrected, redrawn, and quietly passed on had become the backbone of a revolution. She didn't attend the big conferences where men stood on stages and claimed to have solved the mystery of the moving earth. She wasn't invited. When a major journal ran a feature on the discovery of the mid-ocean ridge, it credited 3 male geophysicists and a research vessel. Her name didn't appear, not once. She read the article at her desk, with a cup of tea that had gone cold. When she finished, she turned the page and went back to her work. One day, a student from a university in Scotland wrote to her. He had found her obscure 1953 paper in a library archive. "I don't know if you're still working," he wrote, "but your map is the clearest thing I've seen on this subject. How did no one else notice this before?" She wrote back, short and polite. They weren't looking in the right place. Or perhaps they weren't looking at all. She didn't say that she had spent years being told her work was neat but impractical, or that one professor had described her maps as a woman's attempt to bring order to chaos. She didn't mention the tea she'd made, the reports she'd typed, the way she'd been ignored in meetings where her own data was discussed without her being allowed to speak. She just answered the question. Slowly, more people began to find her, not through official channels, but through whispers, footnotes, old files. A scientist in Norway cited her paper in a footnote so small it was nearly invisible. A researcher in California used her depth corrections in a study and added, in brackets, data from uncredited source, likely British female researcher, active 1950s. She saw a copy once. She smiled. It was the closest thing to recognition she'd had in years. Then in 1968, a book was published, The Dynamic Earth. It became a bestseller in scientific circles. It told the story of how the theory of plate tectonics had been born. It mentioned sonar, magnetic stripes, continental drift. It named professors, institutions, research ships. It had a whole chapter on the mid-ocean ridge. She read it from cover to cover. Nowhere did it mention her. Not her maps. Not her years of plotting data while others made tea. Not her quiet insistence that the ocean floor was not flat, not dead, but alive with movement. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf. Next to it sat a geology textbook from 1940, one that claimed the seafloor was largely featureless and of little geological interest. The contrast was almost funny. A colleague, someone who had once mocked her underwater hill project, came into her office a few weeks later. He was excited. "You've seen the new theory," he said. "It's brilliant. The ridge is where new crust forms. Can you believe it?" She looked up from her desk. "Yes," she said. "I can." He didn't notice the dryness in her voice. Or if he did, he didn't care. He was too busy being impressed with science. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "I've known that for 15 years. She didn't point out that he had once told her to stick to filing when she mentioned the Rift Valley. She just nodded and went back to her work. That night, she sat in her small flat, the window open just a crack, the sound of distant traffic drifting in. On the table in front of her was a stack of letters, some from scientists, some from students, all thanking her, praising her insight, calling her work foundational. None of them had known who she was when they started reading. She didn't keep the letters for pride. She kept them because they proved something. That truth, once drawn clearly enough, could not be buried forever. It might be delayed. It might be misattributed. It might be ignored by the people in charge. But it would find its way out. And if the world wanted to pretend the discovery had come from loud men in lecture halls, rather than a woman with a pencil and too much patience, that was fine. Let them have the speeches. She had the maps, and the maps, unlike people, didn't lie. She retired in 1975, not with a ceremony, but with a small envelope containing her final pay and a card signed by the staff. Dr. Hemsworth had long since left, promoted, then quietly forgotten. The Institute had changed names twice, moved offices, hired new men with new ties and the same old attitudes. She handed in her keys, cleared her desk, and walked out without looking back. No one threw a party. No one made a speech. The younger technicians nodded politely. One asked if she'd be keeping in touch. She said, "Only if you need help reading a contour line." He laughed, not unkindly. She went home to a flat by the sea, not far from where she'd grown up. The view wasn't dramatic, just grey water, a few gulls, the occasional fishing boat trawling slowly along the horizon. She liked it that way. Nothing flashy, nothing that demanded attention. At first she didn't do much. She walked along the shore. She read old books. She fixed the toaster when it broke. Not because she enjoyed it, but because no one else would. Then slowly she began to gather things. Old journals, letters, scraps of paper covered in pencil marks. She didn't write a memoir. She wasn't interested in telling her side of the story. But she sorted the material, filed it neatly, and left it on a shelf, as if someone might one day want to know. Years passed. The world moved on. Plate tectonics became schoolbook fact. The mid-ocean ridge was no longer a mystery, but a chapter in geography lessons. Satellites mapped the seafloor in detail she could never have imagined. And somewhere, in the footnotes of academic papers, her name began to appear. Not often, not loudly, but it was there. In 1994, a university invited her to give a talk. Not because they'd suddenly recognised her work, but because a young lecturer had found her maps in an archive and insisted. The event was small, 20 people in a stuffy room, most of them students who'd come for the free tea. She stood at the front, not nervous, just slightly amused at the idea of being listened to after all this time. She didn't speak about injustice. She didn't list the years she'd been ignored. She talked about data, about lines on paper, about how, if you looked long enough, the earth would show you its shape. Afterwards, a girl approached her, early 20s, nervous, clutching a notebook. "I read about your maps," she said. "They changed everything, didn't they?" She looked at the girl, then out the window, where rain had started to fall. "They helped," she said, "but the sea floor did most of the work." The girl smiled. "Still, you were the one who saw it." She didn't argue, but that night she wrote the girl's words in the back of an old journal, between a tide chart and a shopping list. She never won a major prize. No medal came. No street was named after her. When a science museum opened an exhibit on ocean exploration, her map was displayed in a corner, under glass, with a label that read, "Early Interpretation of Mid-Atlantic Features, 1950s, author unknown." She visited once, stood in front of it. A guard asked if she needed help. She said, "No, I'm just looking." She didn't correct him. What would be the point? The map was there. The ridge was there. The truth was there, even if the name wasn't. She lived quietly. She kept her hair short. She wore sensible shoes. She drank tea without sugar. She never married, never had children. When asked, she said, "I was too busy watching the planet move." Sometimes people thought she was joking. She wasn't. In 2006, a biography of a famous geophysicist was published. In it, he admitted briefly that his breakthrough had relied on detailed maps produced by a woman at a British institute. Name lost to history, unfortunately. She read the passage and thought, not lost, just not handed the microphone. She didn't write to correct him, but she circled the sentence in pencil. She died in 2012, in her sleep, at the age of 95. The local paper ran a small obituary. Marjorie E., retired researcher, beloved sister and aunt, passed peacefully. No mention of maps, no mention of ridges or rifts, or the shape of the earth. But a few weeks later, a student in a geology class raised her hand and asked, "Who first mapped the mid-ocean ridge?" The lecturer paused, then said, "We don't know for sure." But there was a woman, British, worked in the 50s. Her maps were crucial. We don't have much on her. The student made a note. And somewhere, in a flat by the sea, an old notebook still sits on a shelf. Inside, among tide charts and tea stains, is a single line, written in neat faded pencil. They thought it was nothing, but it was everything.